The heat on Verdun Prime had a weight to it that pressed against the skin like a living thing. Tobias Grant peeled off his surgical gloves and stepped into the alley behind the medical station, where recycled water dripped from cooling pipes and made small pools in the cracked pavement. He had 30 seconds before the next patient would arrive, 30 seconds to breathe air that did not smell like fear and antiseptic. Something moved in the shadows between the storage containers. Tobias froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the scanner on his belt. But what emerged was not a scavenger or a lost colonist. The creature that stumbled toward him was the size of a large dog, covered in scales so white they seemed to glow in the dim light. Her wings hung limp at her sides, torn and burned. Around her neck, a metal collar blinked with a steady red pulse that made his stomach turn. He had seen those collars before, in the war. One long blink, too short. Termination order. The dragon hatchling collapsed at his feet. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her sides heaving with effort. Burns marked her scales in ugly patterns, the kind made by compliance rods used on animals that refused to obey. When Tobias knelt beside her, she did not snap or hiss. Instead, she looked at him with eyes the color of winter ice and waited. Training took over. He checked her pulse, found it weak but steady. Dehydration, exhaustion, multiple burn wounds. Treatable if she would let him treat her. He reached for his water bottle, took a slow drink himself, then offered it to her. The hatchling watched the ritual carefully before lapping at the water with careful control, stopping herself after only a few swallows. She had been trained. Someone had taught her discipline, patience, trust. Tobias examined the collar without touching it. The serial number marked her as property of the Colonial Council, tagged for immediate disposal. The last signal from orbit had been sent 40 minutes ago. Somewhere in the city, enforcement teams were searching for this creature, ready to complete their orders. He should have called them, should have reported the breach, let the authorities handle it. That was the safe choice, the legal choice. Instead, he slid his fingers under the collar and accessed its diagnostic port. The data made his jaw tighten. Site designation, asset classification, sterilization authorization. Buried in the technical language was a location he recognized. Sector 7. The dead zone outside the colony where nothing grew and nobody went. The place where the council had sealed something away decades ago and forbidden anyone from asking questions. The hatchling nudged his hand with her snout, a gentle pressure that carried no demand. When he turned his palm up, she placed one clawed foot in it and took 3 slow breaths as though counting time by his heartbeat. Then she released him, not in rejection but in completion of some agreement he had not known he was making. Tobias made his decision. He carried her inside through the back entrance, ignoring the startled looks from his assistant. In the examination room, he cut the collar's tracking signal and rerouted its telemetry through his personal device. The authorities would think she was still moving through the southern districts while he worked. The wounds were worse up close. Someone had used pain to control her, had hurt her deliberately to break her spirit, but the hatchling bore it all with a dignity that made his chest ache. When he cleaned the burns and applied regeneration gel, she made a sound low in her throat that might have been gratitude. He pulled up a map on his scanner, tracing the coordinates from the collar. The dead zone, whatever lay out there, the council wanted it to stay buried, and this hatchling, this small white dragon with her termination orders and her careful trust, wanted him to help her reach it. Tobias looked at his schedule. 2 surgeries planned, inventory reports due, a dozen reasons to stay where it was safe. Then he looked at the dragon, who watched him with ancient patience and young eyes. He packed a medical kit, supplies for 3 days and a portable power converter, left a message for the night staff that he would return when he could. The hatchling refused to ride in a carrier, instead walking beside him on legs that trembled but held, her head high despite her exhaustion. In the garage, his rover waited with its cracked dashboard and failing climate control. The hatchling settled on the floor between the seats, pressing against the console where she could feel the engine's vibration. Tobias started the vehicle and pointed it toward the edge of the colony, toward the dead zone and whatever secrets it held. The sun was setting over Verdun Prime, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. Behind them, the city began to glow with its evening lights. Ahead, the wasteland stretched dark and empty. The hatchling made a soft sound, almost like a purr. Tobias drove into the gathering darkness and did not look back. The wasteland began where the colony's promises ended. Tobias watched the pavement turn to packed dirt, then to salt flats that stretched toward the horizon like a frozen ocean. The rover's wheels crunched over crystallized earth, leaving tracks that the wind would erase before morning. Beside him, Snow, as he had begun to call the hatchling, kept her nose pressed to the window, her pale eyes tracking landmarks only she could recognize. The first warning marker appeared an hour past the colony limits. A metal pylon jutted from the ground, solar panels dark with dust, displaying a biohazard symbol and text in 6 languages. Keep out, authorized personnel only. Violators subject to immediate detention. Snow lifted her head and made a low chirping sound. Not fear. Recognition. Tobias drove past the marker without slowing. His scanner showed 3 more pylons forming a perimeter around the dead zone, each one broadcasting a signal that told his vehicle's navigation system to turn back. He disabled the safety protocols and kept going. The land changed as they crossed into forbidden territory. Plants grew here, but wrong. Trees with bark that spiraled in patterns too perfect to be natural. Grass that shimmered with an oily sheen when the wind touched it. In the distance, the ruins of old structures poked through the soil like bones. Buildings that had been half buried by time and official forgetfulness. Tobias had read the public records about Sector 7. 40 years ago, it had been a research station studying local wildlife. Then something happened. Something the reports called an incident without ever explaining what that meant. The station was evacuated, the sector quarantined, and the council declared the land too contaminated for habitation. Questions were discouraged. Curiosity was redirected, but sitting in the passenger footwell, breathing in time with the engine's rhythm, was evidence that the official story had holes. The sun dropped below the horizon and darkness came fast. Tobias switched on the rover's headlights and immediately regretted it. In the wash of illumination, he saw movement, shapes that scattered from the light, too fast to identify, leaving only the impression of scales and wings and eyes that reflected red. Snow pressed herself lower but did not hide. She watched the darkness beyond the windows with the focus of a sentry on duty. They drove through the ruins of what might have been a town. Foundations marked the ground in neat rectangles, streets laid out with colonial optimism that had died before the first houses finished rising. The rover's headlights caught fragments of lives abandoned in haste, a child's toy half buried in sand, a door hanging from one hinge swaying in the night breeze, a sign that read, "Welcome to New Haven." The letters faded to ghosts. Tobias stopped the vehicle at the edge of the ghost town and checked his scanner. The caller's last recorded signal pointed toward a canyon system 10 kilometers north. According to the map, nothing existed there except rock and empty air. According to Snow, who tapped her claw against the windshield with insistent precision, that was exactly where they needed to go. He rationed water and field rations, taking small portions and waiting for Snow to mirror him before eating more. She had learned to match his consumption, to take only what he took, and it broke something in his heart each time. He tried giving her extra, but she refused, turning her head away until he understood that fairness mattered more than hunger. They slept in the rover with the engine off to conserve power. Tobias wedged himself against the door while Snow curled on the floor, her tail wrapped around his ankle as though anchoring them both against the night. Through the windows, stars blazed with a clarity the colony lights never allowed. Between the stars, something moved, dark shapes against darker sky circling high above the wasteland, patrol drones, searching. Snow's eyes opened, reflecting the faint instrument lights. She made no sound, but Tobias felt the tension in her small body. He placed his hand on her back and counted breaths until the drones passed overhead and continued south. Morning came with a sky the color of old bruises. Tobias started the rover and followed the canyon's direction, leaving the ghost town behind. The land rose in jagged steps, rock formations that looked like they had been broken and badly mended. Mineral deposits painted the stone in streaks of rust and copper, veins of color that led the eye toward the horizon. The canyon entrance appeared suddenly, a crack in the earth that the map insisted did not exist. Tobias stopped the rover and studied the opening. It was wide enough for the vehicle, but barely. The walls were smooth in places, marked with symbols that erosion had not quite erased. Official seals, he realized. Council stamps burned into the rock and then abandoned to weather and time. Snow jumped from the rover before he could stop her. She padded to the canyon entrance and paused at the threshold. One paw raised, her head tilted as though listening to sounds beyond human hearing. Then she looked back at him and her crest lifted. A gesture he had learned meant hurry. Tobias grabbed his medical kit and followed. The canyon swallowed them in shadow. Temperature dropped 20 degrees between one step and the next, the air suddenly damp and cool. His boots found purchase on stone worn smooth by water that no longer flowed. The walls pressed close, covered in more of those official seals, layered over each other like scar tissue trying to hide an old wound. Snow moved ahead with confidence, her white scales visible even in the dimness. She navigated turns without hesitation, following a path she had never walked but somehow knew. Twice she stopped and pressed her nose to the canyon wall, breathing deeply, reading information Tobias could not perceive. The canyon opened into a chamber that stole his breath. The walls here were not natural stone but smooth panels marked with a grid pattern too precise for accident. In the center of the chamber, the ground was darker, as though something had been sealed beneath a layer of artificial rock. The air tasted strange, metallic and old, like the inside of a long-closed vault. Snow walked to the center and placed her 4 paws on specific points, pressing down in a careful rhythm. 4 beats, precise as a heartbeat. Then she stepped back and looked at Tobias with those winter-pale eyes. "Your turn," her gaze said. Tobias knelt and placed his palm where Snow had marked the ground. The stone was warm, warmer than the cool air allowed, warmer than sun-heated rock should be in shadow. He pressed down and felt something shift beneath the surface, a mechanism waking after decades of sleep. A seam appeared in the floor, straight lines forming a rectangle, edges too perfect to be anything but manufactured. Something was buried here, something the council had tried very hard to make everyone forget. And Snow, the small white dragon with her termination collar and her unshakable purpose, had crossed a wasteland to bring him to this exact spot. Tobias looked at his medical kit, at his tools meant for healing bodies, not opening tombs. Then he looked at Snow, who waited with patient faith. He began to work. The seals fought him with the stubbornness of old promises. Tobias worked his surgical tools into the seams, coaxing metal that had forgotten how to bend, persuading locks that had spent 40 years learning to be stone. His hands ached. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the chamber's cool air, but he had opened wounds that wanted to stay closed before, had convinced flesh to heal when it preferred to quit. This was the same work, just different materials. Snow sat beside him, her breath steady and patient. Occasionally she would hum, a sound so low he felt it more than heard it, and the seals would loosen slightly, as though recognizing a voice they had been built to obey. 3 hours passed before the first lock surrendered. The click echoed through the chamber like a bone setting back into place. Tobias sat back, flexing his cramped fingers, and checked his scanner. The readings made no sense. Heat signatures where there should be only cold stone. Faint atmospheric movement suggesting the chamber beneath was not empty but breathing. He looked at Snow. She had not moved, had not lost focus, her gaze fixed on the sealed floor as though she could see through it to what lay beneath. The second lock released faster, its mechanism weakened by the first surrender. The third fought longest, corroded by time and moisture that had seeped through microscopic cracks. Tobias used his medical gel to soften the corrosion, worked the tool with the patience he used on delicate surgeries, and finally felt the lock give way. The floor section rose with a pneumatic hiss that spoke of systems still functioning after decades. Lights flickered to life along the edges, emergency power waking from hibernation. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying scents of mineral and metal and something else. Something alive. Tobias peered into the opening. A chamber lay beneath, walls lined with equipment that still blinked with status lights. In the center, surrounded by humming machinery, was a stasis pod large enough to hold something the size of a transport vehicle. Frost covered its surface, but through the ice he could see scales. White scales, opalescent and huge. Snow made a sound he had never heard before. Not a chirp or a hum, but a cry. High and desperate and full of recognition. She scrambled to the edge of the opening, her small body trembling. Tobias descended the ladder, his medical kit banging against his back. The chamber below was a marvel of old technology. Systems designed to run indefinitely on geothermal power. Monitors displayed vital signs in languages he barely understood, but the patterns were unmistakable. Heartbeat, respiration, brain activity. all reduced to the barest minimum, a body held at the edge of sleep waiting for a reason to wake. He approached the stasis pod and wiped frost from its viewing panel. The dragon inside was massive, easily 15 meters from snout to tail. Her scales were the same white as Snow's, marked with patterns of silver that caught the light like flowing water. Her wings were folded tight against her body, and around her neck was a collar identical to Snow's but larger, older, its light long since dark. Snow descended the ladder with reckless speed and pressed herself against the pod's surface. She made that crying sound again, and this time the dragon inside stirred. Just a fraction, just the smallest movement of one eye, but it was response. Recognition. Mother and daughter, Tobias realized. The council had not just quarantined this place. They had imprisoned a dragon and then tried to execute her child. His scanner beeped urgently. The signal was faint but growing stronger. The enforcement teams had tracked his rover to the canyon. He had minutes, maybe less, before they arrived. Tobias studied the stasis controls. The system was designed for gradual revival, a process meant to take days to avoid shocking the body. He did not have days. He had the time it took for armed enforcement to descend into the chamber and complete their 40-year-old execution order. He made the same choice he had made in the alley behind the medical station. The choice that said some orders deserved to be broken. He rerouted the revival sequence through his medical scanner, overriding the safety protocols with codes he had learned in combat zones, where regulation killed more patients than injury. The stasis pod systems argued with him in warning tones and flashing lights. But he had argued with dying bodies before. He knew how to be more stubborn than death. The frost began to melt. The humming of the machinery rose in pitch. Inside the pod, the great white dragon's chest expanded with her first full breath in 4 decades. Voices echoed from above. Boots on stone. Radio chatter calling for backup. Tobias worked faster, adjusting temperature, oxygen mix, stimulant dosages. He had revived hypothermia victims, had coaxed hearts to beat when they preferred silence. This was bigger, but the principles were the same. Everybody wants to live if given the chance. The pod seal broke with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The lid lifted on servos that groaned but obeyed. The dragon inside opened her eyes, and they were the same pale winter color as Snow's, but vast and deep and full of an intelligence that made Tobias step back involuntarily. Snow leaped into the pod without hesitation, pressing herself against her mother's chest. The great dragon lowered her head and touched her snout to the hatchling's back, a gesture so tender it made Tobias's throat tight. Then Silverwind, because he somehow knew that was her name, raised her head and looked at him. He had been looked at by many things in his life. Patients evaluating his competence, commanders judging his loyalty. But this was different. This was a being who had spent 40 years in forced sleep, who had been separated from her child and marked for death, looking at the human who had chosen to help despite every reason not to. She stood, and the chamber suddenly seemed too small. Ice fell from her scales in sheets. Her wings unfolded with a sound like sails catching wind. The machinery around her sparked and died, its purpose fulfilled. Above, the enforcement team reached the opening. Light swept into the chamber. A voice amplified by speakers demanded immediate surrender. Silverwind looked at the opening, then back at Tobias. She lowered herself so her shoulder was level with his chest and tilted her head toward her back. The meaning was clear. Tobias climbed onto the dragon's back, his hands finding purchase between scales, Snow scrambling up beside him. Silverwind bunched her muscles and launched upward with power that should not have fit in the confined space. She hit the chamber opening with her shoulder, and the reinforced entrance shattered like pottery. Stone and metal exploded outward as she burst into the canyon, her wings snapping open, catching air for the first time in 40 years. Enforcement vehicles scattered. Armed personnel dove for cover. Drones tried to track her movement, but she was already climbing, rising into the morning sky with strokes that shook dust from the canyon walls. Tobias clung to her back. Snow pressed against his chest and watched the wasteland drop away beneath them. The colony was a smudge on the horizon. The quarantine zone was a scar across the land. And above, the sky was open and endless. Silverwind flew toward the rising sun, and with each wing beat, she left behind the prison that had held her, the orders that had tried to end her, the fear that said some lives were too dangerous to allow. In his pocket, Tobias's scanner beeped with incoming messages. Demands for explanation, threats of legal action, orders to return immediately. He turned it off and held tighter to the dragon who had trusted a stranger's mercy. Below, the wasteland gave way to green lands beyond the colony's reach. Places where old things could begin again, where hatchlings could grow without collars around their necks, where sometimes, just sometimes, the right choice was the one that broke all the rules. Snow chirped happily in the wind. Silverwind answered with a sound that might have been laughter. And Tobias, field medic of Verdun Prime, smiled and let the sky carry them all toward whatever came next. The officials had ordered the dragon's end, but they had not counted on a hatchling's determination or a human's refusal to let mercy die in the name of procedure. Some bonds once formed were stronger than any law. Some lives were worth every rule broken to save them. This was just the beginning of their story.